Mira que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 49, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media, coming in with one of my favorite communist songs, La Muralla by Quilapayún, a very revolutionary group from Chile that has amazing music from the socialist era. And today, the myth of capitalist democracy, bourgeois democracy, exposing imperialist propaganda from the 2021 Summit for Democracy, which took place from December 8th through 10th, earlier this month. And during today's episode, we're going to debunk some of the speeches. We have some of the talking points that were delivered at the summit that speak in favor of capitalism and use this term democracy very vaguely in a way that favors capitalism and imperialism. We're going to talk about the difference between bourgeois and socialist democracy. And we're also going to talk about what real revolutionary democracy looks like, especially in Venezuela, a country that one of our comrades has spent several weeks in, a lot of time in, and has firsthand experienced the Bolivarian Revolution and has also defended it on live TV, which we'll go into in a bit. And joining me today are comrades Mercedes Gómez and Dakota Lilly. Mercedes is a writer and scholar who focuses and has written about Puerto Rico and its economic relationship to the U.S. since 1898. How's it going, compañera Mercedes?
All good. Almost Merry Christmas. So Merry Christmas.
Most definitely. Christmas is coming up, and the end of the year at 2021 has totally flown by. I'm still thinking in my head it's 2020, so I'm kind of still stuck in
God.
the
I
March
think it's
pandemic,
2019 at the time.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's crazy. I feel like the older you get, the more time flies faster. But it's great to have you on. By the way, we did a great stream a few weeks ago with Comrade Josh Finn from In Defense of Liberation about mind control and capitalist media. And it's one of those topics that I think Mercedes is good for discussing, is how propaganda works, especially in the realm of psychology, and how they use sentiments like empathy and emotion to try to control and brainwash us into supporting their agenda. And also joining us is Comrade Dakota Lilly, political analyst from rural Pennsylvania, who has been involved in anti-imperialist and popular organizing since he was 15. Very young. When I was 15, I was doing dumb shit. I was hanging out on the streets till late at night with my friends, getting into trouble. But Dakota was organizing, so Dakota had their shit together. Dakota holds a BA in politics and specializes in the areas of political economy, Latin America, socialism of 21st century, left-wing populism, Chavismo, Peronismo, the pink tide, and he's also affectionately known within our circles of the left as El Gringo Chavista. Dakota, how's it going?
Pretty good. A little cold, but pretty good.
Yeah, most especially in rural Pennsylvania, it's probably cold as hell out there. By the way, what does your shirt say?
Oh, this
Unidos.
is Unidos y Organizados. It's from Argentina, one of the groups that got together to defend the government of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner when she was president before.
Most definitely, that's what's up. And I know you're somebody who is very open-minded and accepting about supporting all sorts of movements within the left. Unfortunately, a lot of times people have a very dogmatic or purist view about supporting movements in Latin America. And what I like about you, Dakota, is that in a lot of your analysis and writing and commentary, you're not afraid to defend movements that are not trendy or popular to support. So I definitely respect that, and see that in a lot of your trips to Latin America have really defined your views of socialism. So basically, this summit that took place in December 9th through 10th, I mean, one thing that was crazy to me is that the countries invited, first of all, Russia, China, Iran were not invited, which was obvious. This summit, even though it's called the Summit for Democracy, was basically the summit for imperialism, the summit for capitalism, and in many ways was a pathetic attempt by the US government, the Democrats, the Biden administration to build a coalition against what they see as illiberalism, as anti democratic governments. And it failed, honestly. It was not popular at all. Among the Latin American countries, the US invited Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay, but they excluded Bolivia, Cuba, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Very interesting lineup. What I found really interesting about that in particular, within the excluded countries, Bolivia, obviously, you have the Movement Towards Socialism Party, an amazing revolutionary party. Cuba, you know, what else can we say about Cuba, the revolutionary beacon for the region? Nicaragua, the Sandinista Revolution, Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution. But they also excluded El Salvador, which is led by a US-backed leader called Nayib Bukele, who made Bitcoin the legal tender of the country. So it's interesting that within the Democrats on the left, sometimes they give a little smack to their own puppets to try to make it seem like they're para disimular, to make it seem like they're okay, we're condemning both sides, totalitarian on both sides. So I found that really fascinating. So what I want to do is I want to play a clip from Biden's opening speech, which he was struggling, by the way. He was struggling to get through the speech, man. It seemed like he was cranky. He's like, I want to go back to bed. He wasn't even present there. So Sleepy Joe, we're going to hear from Sleepy Joe right now, talking about the Summit for Democracy.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Summit for Democracy. This gathering has been on my mind for a long time for a simple reason. In the face of sustained and alarming challenges to democracy, universal human rights, and all around the world, democracy needs champions. And I wanted to host this summit because here in the United States, we know as well as anyone that renewing our democracy and strengthening our democratic institutions requires constant effort. American democracy is an ongoing struggle to live up to our highest ideals and to heal our divisions, to recommit ourselves to the founding idea of our nation, captured in our Declaration of Independence, not unlike many of your documents. We say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all women and men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to renew it with each generation, and this is an urgent matter on all our parts, in my view, because the data we're seeing is largely pointing in the wrong direction. Freedom House reports in 2020 that marked the 15th consecutive year of global freedom in retreat. Another recent report from the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance noted more than half of all democracies have experienced a decline in at least one aspect of their democracy over the last 10 years, including the United States. And these trends are being exacerbated by global challenges that are more complex than ever and which require shared efforts to address these concerns. By outside pressure from autocrats, they seek to advance their own power, export and expand their influence around the world, and justify the repressive policies and practices as a more efficient way to address today's challenges. That's how it's sold. By voices that seek to fan the flames of social division and political polarization. And perhaps most importantly, and most worrying of all, by increasing the dissatisfaction of people all around the world with democratic governments that they feel are failing to deliver for their needs. In my view, this is the defining challenge of our time. Democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Sleepy Joe struggling. He didn't have his mid-afternoon nap, so you can tell he was kind of fumbling through that. But one thing I found really interesting is the fact that he cites Freedom House and International Institute for Democracy, which are both corporate think tanks backed by the biggest multinational companies, BP, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. Every major corporation invested in the military-industrial complex funds these think tanks, funds these institutions, the Council on Foreign Relations, that determine who's democratic and who's not democratic. The biggest corporations that profit from war determine this, and he's citing it. So it's one of those things that if you don't kind of look into it, you'll never see how capitalism runs this concept of democracy. But maybe we can start off with you, compañera Mercedes. Your thoughts on this idea. What do you think about the idea that capitalism and democracy are hand in hand in the U.S.?
I mean, I think it's bullshit, but when I watched that whole opening, I felt kind of bad mostly because I feel like a lot of people, it made me think of just like going through public school and like the history classes and all this, and you're taught like, okay, yeah, democracy is what we have here, and all the other things are not democratic, and that's why that's failing and this is succeeding. And just the way that they spun the whole, all these autocrats, they want to promote their hegemony and all this was like, very weirdly narcissistic. I feel like that was like my overall take of even just that whole opening was like it was weirdly narcissistic, and the way that the US is like, oh, we're not the first, we're not the absolute best, we're gonna make a new thing so that we are number one. And then in turn, living here, how insular it is, you're like, yeah, this is the only thing you see, so it's number one. And the whole, like, the country does it with this summit, they'll do it with like a soccer league, and the idea that like this is democratic, I think is just like, well, if we never see anything more, you know, we're not taught like, hey, this is capitalism, this is what it is, and all the things that we're complaining about that suck, you know, the fact that you can't get a job right, the fact that your job isn't paying you right, the fact that, you know, there's people who putting profit over people. Everybody says all these things and intrinsically knows it, but then we don't see beyond anything else. We're just like, oh, it's just everything's a broken system. If it's good here, then everything else must be an absolute hellhole.
Yeah, definitely. And I think people in the US understand that at the end of the day, like the people who really run the show are the capitalists, the ruling class. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions about democracy is that whenever you have, at least according to Marxism, the historical materialist outlook, is that every society in history is a dictatorship. Right now, we live in a dictatorship of the wealthy, the ruling class. They decide why we go to work, who we go to work for, the things that we need. Because we don't have access to the means of production, we're forced to live lives that we don't want to live. We're forced to go to that 9 to 5. We're forced to dress a certain way and have certain things because we live in the dictatorship of the ruling class. And under socialism, under a socialist democracy, you have the dictatorship, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat that Lenin describes, where you have democracy among the working class, but they exercise a dictatorship over the ruling class, as we see in countries like Venezuela and Cuba, Nicaragua, and other places that are building socialism. Comrade Dakota, your reaction to the Summit for Democracy and this idea that capitalism and democracy work hand in hand?
Well, I think I mean, even just looking at some of the participants of this so-called Summit for Democracy, like you have Brazil, which has, is being eviscerated by COVID. You've had lawmakers that have been chased out of the country. You've had Maria Franco, who was killed with impunity. Colombia, where social leaders are killed all the time, and indigenous children die every single day in the La Guarica region. So even they know it's kind of bullshit. They're not really pretending at this point. They're trying to say, yeah, this is a summit for our kind of democracy, a democracy for the elites, a democracy for the rich, a liberal democracy. And it was also interesting to me because not all of the participants of this Summit for Democracy, even kind of parroted the same line. Like when Argentina attended, President Alberto Fernandez, he used his 2 minutes to talk about the coup in Bolivia. And he called Bolivia right now a democracy and an example for democracy. And he called out the OAS and the US for participating in the coup against Evo Morales. So that kind of it is kind of interesting how that was kind of egg on the face of Joe Biden and the United States, how at their own summit, they have people that are calling them out for that. And yeah, there's a lot of different ways that capitalism is antithetical to democracy, in my view. How is it that we have so many rich or so few rich people and so many poor people? How is it that we live in a society that's poverty amongst plenty? How can that be democratic? Hugo Chavez said that democracy and capitalism simply can't live next together, and how it's a democracy of the elites. And I think that's true. It's and I think, like you said, Ramiro, I think most people in the United States know that there's something wrong, that we don't live in a democracy, because most of them are pissed off. Most of them aren't happy with the way things are, whether it's the economy, like Congress has an abysmal approval rating, people hate politicians, etc. They know this isn't a democracy, but this is what they've been told their entire lives is a democracy.
Yeah, most definitely. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening, by the way. Phil State Fishing said, any organization originating from the US does the opposite of what it's named. Most definitely right. Like all these organizations with democracy in them, you can tell, are just completely bullshit. Phil State Fishing also said, glad Nicaragua decided to cut ties with Taiwan and form ties with China instead, happening around the summit. Most definitely. I think that was a game changer. And I think that the US is scared as fuck that the People's Republic of China, the real China, actually has popular support in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that our countries are moving away from the domination of Washington and Wall Street. Shout out to Char Darling. Biden is just a belligerent, cranky old man, dude. I don't even think he's alive, man. I think he's been dead for like 5 years, and they're just like puppeting him or using
It's like
AI. But
it's like that guy from what prince was it? Like Charles or Philip or whatever. The one who looked like was like a defrosted corpse.
literally,
Yeah.
he literally looks like a defrosted corpse that they're just like moving around like a puppet. So who the fuck knows, man? Invalid Arc said bourgeois democracy is democracy for the masters, not the slaves. Yeah, I mean I think that's the thing. Like people, whenever I talk to people about socialism and revolutionary movements in other countries in the US, they just a lot of times people don't understand that democracy and an economic system are totally different. Like the political system, the economic system can totally be different. You know, you have, for example, in Iran, you have an Islamic revolution, and it's not necessarily socialist, but they have Islamic democracy in Iran. And different countries have democracy catered to their individual systems that they have. And I think it's really, that's why I tell people it's important to travel and to visit other countries to understand that democracy isn't just having Republicans and Democrats, Yankees, Mets, you know, Coke, Pepsi, bipartisanship on every matter. So what I want to do is I also want to play a clip from Anthony Blinken, who is the Secretary of State. Here he's talking about the role of media in democracy. This is something that U.S. imperialists like to bring up a lot when they talk about press freedom in other countries, just because in socialist and anti-imperialist countries, they censor those who are spouting lies and imperialist propaganda, which I support, by the way. But the U.S. using this myth of freedom of the press and free speech uses this to justify regime change. So I'm going to play this clip and get your reaction.
I'd like to recognize the extraordinary work of journalists and media workers around the world. That includes the Nobel Peace Prize laureates participating in this event, Maria Ressa, Dmitry Muratov, and all the journalists watching today. Your reporting plays an indispensable role in informing the public, holding governments accountable, and telling stories that otherwise would not be told, all of which is critical to the health of democracies like ours. And yet, as we all know, for too many journalists, doing this work means having to endure threats, harassment, attacks. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 23 journalists have been killed for their work in 2021, and scores more have been attacked. More than 350 journalists are currently being imprisoned in connection to their work, according to Reporters Without Borders. Of course, these aren't the only ways press freedom is under assault. Governments are using libel, defamation, and counterterrorism laws to go after reporters who shine a spotlight on corruption and abuse. Last year, nearly 20 countries passed overly broad and vague laws related to the COVID-19 pandemic, which they have used to crack down on journalists under the pretext of combating misinformation. Media websites and journalists' social media accounts are increasingly blocked, censored, or restricted in other ways. And some governments are cutting advertising for independent media outlets that they see as critical, deepening the economic pressures on these publications. As a result, many outlets have shut down, consolidated, or been acquired by government or corporate entities. The number of news deserts around the world is growing, depriving citizens of the accurate, trustworthy information they need to participate fully in civic and political life. Journalists, advocacy organizations, and foundations are doing everything they can to push back, but they can't do it alone. At the Summit for Democracy this week, we're asking governments to make concrete commitments to strengthen free, independent media and help tackle the diverse challenges that they face. Today, I'd like to highlight 4 ways the United States is doing that, among others. First, we're increasing protection for the free press here at home. In July, the Department of Justice adopted a new policy to stop using subpoenas, warrants, and other investigative powers to obtain notes, work products, or other information from journalists engaged in news-gathering activities. Second, at the summit, we are announcing significant new investments to support independent media in financial peril. We'll make the biggest contribution by any government to the recently launched International Fund for Public Interest Media, an innovative new initiative that provides assistance to at-risk independent news outlets. The fund will be administered not by governments, but by an inclusive group of independent, well-respected journalists, media, and financial experts. In addition, USAID will announce the launch of a Media Viability Accelerator, which will bring together media outlets, business advisory groups, and the private sector to make independent press outlets more sustainable, focusing on data sharing, technical assistance, and financial services. These new efforts will come atop the $236 million President Biden has requested in the 2022 budget to support independent media around the globe, a more than 40% increase on the amount allotted in 2020. Third, we're launching a new liability fund to provide financial support for reporters and news organizations that are targeted with litigation as a result of their reporting. These include cases like that of Diana Monroy, an investigative journalist I met on a recent visit to Quito. At the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic in Ecuador, she helped unearth a scheme by a former president and health officials to sell body bags to public hospitals at 13 times their price. In retaliation, the former president threatened Diana's life and filed a legal complaint against her under a law that protects sensitive data. The fund we're launching will support journalists like Diana as they defend themselves against such baseless legal efforts. Finally, we will continue to be relentless in shining a spotlight on attacks on journalists and demanding accountability for perpetrators. Because we know that one of the most effective ways to prevent future attacks is by sending a clear message that those responsible will be brought to justice. Let me give a few examples of how the United States is doing this right now. We denounce cases publicly by name and elevate them in our bilateral engagements with other governments. We use targeted sanctions to impose costs on perpetrators, including new authorities we've conceived and implemented, such as the Khashoggi ban. We push for greater multilateral pressure through institutions like the Media Freedom Coalition, which has strongly condemned cases of repression in Belarus, Hong Kong, Burma, and Russia. And we continue to make deep, long-term investments in the rule of law, so local justice officials have the knowledge and capacity to effectively prosecute these crimes. And while impunity is still the norm in far too many of these cases, we cannot let up, because it's never too late for justice. Just last week, a court in Serbia confirmed the conviction of 4 former security officials for the murder of journalist Slavko Čurovija. Slavko was executed outside his home in Belgrade on April 11, 1999, for daring to criticize the country's leader at the time, Slobodan Milosevic. So I want to make crystal clear, the United States will continue to stand up for the brave and necessary work of journalists around the world. And I look forward to hearing the commitments other governments will make in the summit, not only to ensure justice for past attacks and to prevent future attacks, but also to shore up the vibrant, independent press our democracies depend on for years to come. Thank you.
It's crazy that people would watch and listen to that and think, yeah, right on. He's totally right. And shout out to Jared Ball, by the way. Too bad this isn't an SNL sketch. Most definitely. It seems so fake, so completely fabricated. And I just picture him at the end being like, live from New York. It's Saturday night. Non-standard proletarian. God, that guy is disgusting. It'll stay fishing. Free Assange. The U.S. has been hunting Assange for years. I love how they never mention Assange, and even though the U.S. is murdering basically a journalist who has exposed so many of the crimes of empire. Also, Invalid Arg said Blinken just wants to push for more overseas propaganda outlets like Radio Free Asia, Free Alex Saab, Venezuelan diplomat who has been kidnapped. Free media and capitalism is in fact corporate-controlled media. Independent media equals capitalist neoliberal propaganda, according to Blinken. Criminal, inhumane sanctions. So much that they were mentioning in that video clip, and so much nonsense. But maybe we can start off with you, Comrade Mercedes. Your reaction to all that?
That's my reaction. No, everything they said was, I was like, in my head, I'm like, that's you, bro. Everything you said. Real quick, Jared Ball, I think you're cool. I've started reading your book. Hi.
Yeah, Jared Ball is dope. Shout out to Black Power Media.
No, it's funny because he was like, oh, people are using COVID as an excuse. And I'm like, that's literally everything that you do, especially on Instagram. And like how many times, people try to share something that's happened in Palestine or that happened in Colombia or like anywhere, and it was censored. Or even in Puerto Rico, there's a guy, and I always forget his name. It's like Elise or Elisa something. But he was like showing that there were it was something to do with the Act 20 and how people were buying up land and all this, and he was showing the problems with it, and the FBI was after him. So everything that they said was just complete nonsense. It was hypocritical. It was like not even projection. It was just like we're pretending like everyone else is doing it, but then never turning the lens over and being like, hey, well, they never would. But it's frustrating how much of what they say is actually the U.S., or if it's not, it's the U.S. is behind it in some kind of way or agreeing with it. It's obnoxious.
Yeah, no, and the crazy part about it is they mentioned that so-called authoritarian governments are censoring and blocking media, even though they're doing the same thing. Like, what's interesting to note is that 3 days before the election in Nicaragua on November 7th, over 300 Sandinista media outlets were censored and completely wiped off the face of the earth. YouTube, Facebook, all these Silicon Valley media outlets, they were deleted before the election even happened, saying that they were puppets, saying that they were troll farms and all this nonsense. I had one of my comrades, Camilo, who I met in Nicaragua, on the podcast talking about how he's been building these accounts, Red Evolucion, one of these accounts for years. And one day, just like that, they wipe it out, and this is what, like you said, it's projection, because this is exactly what the U.S. imperialists are doing with deleting accounts, not only deleting and censoring left-wing accounts, also Chavista accounts and Cuban accounts as well during the quote-unquote during the color revolution attempt in Cuba, but they also create these fake bot accounts that are used to make it seem like there's some popular uprising on social media against leftist government. So maybe Dakota.
No, though I'm just saying, like they'll say as well, oh, the reason why this is censored is because it has misinformation on COVID. And you'll read things and you're like, nothing ever mentioned COVID. Or they'll say, oh, this goes against community guidelines about like tolerance, but nobody ever was being disrespectful to like any group of any kind, except to say like just calling things out for what they were. And it's like, oh, it's censored, it's bad.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And as Patria o Muerte mentioned, shadow banning is even worse. They don't delete the post, but they don't show it. They make it hard for people to follow and subscribe. Midwestern March was silenced during SOS Cuba, most definitely. Dakota, your reaction to that, the media, the role of media in capitalist propaganda and this notion of democracy?
I mean, obviously I agree, but it's funny how much they project, every single thing that they are accusing other people of doing, they either do or their allies do. Like, I didn't hear Blinken mention anything about people in Saudi Arabia or in Palestine or in Colombia. The list is endless. He's talking about a case in 1999 about Milosevic, when there's people dying every single day, citizen journalists between Colombia and Central America, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just asinine. And again, like I've been banned twice from Twitter now for no reason. After being on the platform for years, building it up, the only way of communication with certain people, they just get rid of it one day for no reason. And it's so interesting how a country with such conglomerates when it comes to the media, they have a handful of companies which control 90 to 99% of all information in this country. Yet they attack other countries when they try to break up media conglomerates, like they did to Argentina. Argentina, under Cristina, decriminalized libel. It was no longer a thing, but they didn't have anything to say but the fact that they were attacking media conglomerates. It's all anything that they can use to weaponize propaganda, to use against countries that don't agree with neoliberalism or capitalism, they'll use. And this is one of the one of these spaces. And plus, they're always taught, like, there's such a canonization of certain journalists, which I completely disagree with. I hate to say it, but a lot of these journalists are liars and they, toe the line. It used to be that the idea of the media was supposed to be a check on government. Now it's the only time they're a check on government is when the government is anti-neoliberal or anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist. Otherwise, they take their lead from the United States government. What else is there to say? It's hypocritical and it's bullshit.
It's funny too, because like I've seen like a couple clips from the Daily Show, and it's like, the Daily Show is supposed to be like not liberal, excuse me, it's supposed to be like progressive and left wing or whatever. But what's his face, like Trevor Noah was just going on and was like bashing China for like being in Africa, and you can make actual like sound criticism of the relationship certain countries are having with China, and you could talk about why or this or that, but he was making it off like, oh, they're the new colonial master and they're like the new French or this or that, and it's like the French were literally bombing people 2 weeks ago, but nobody said anything. And now suddenly, and he wasn't the only one. I feel like I saw something else about China, or like every other day, like the China, like anti-China, just like ramping up harder and harder and harder. Oh, and the anti-Russia.
Yeah. No, I think and Trevor Noah was fucking whack, first of all. He has no idea what the fuck he's talking about. He's a puppet token diversity hire for US imperialism. And it's really sad to think that he thinks he's funny. He's just putting forth imperialist talking points. Talking about the anti-China propaganda, I want to play a clip. This is from a Taiwan representative. Taiwan is China, by the way, the People's Republic of China. Taiwan is the breakaway province. So after the Chinese Revolution, 1949, during the Chinese Civil War, you had the communist movement led by Mao Zedong, the National Liberation Movement. You also had the Kuomintang, I think I'm mispronouncing it, but they were the nationalist right-wing movement that was backed by the West. And after the Chinese Revolution, the right-wing forces were pushed onto the island of Taiwan, or Formosa as it was known as well. And from there, they declared themselves to be the Republic of China. Mainland China, obviously the People's Republic of China, building socialism under the Communist Party. And Taiwan has always been heralded as some beacon of democracy and is basically a colonized, militarized area that the Western imperialists are trying to use as a bastion of reaction in Asia against China. And so this representative, Audrey Tang, is speaking about what they describe as Chinese authoritarianism. So we're going to play this and talk a little bit more about the China bashing at this democracy summit.
Ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary friends, good local time. I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister. It is my honor to represent Taiwan at a Summit for Democracy along with Representative B. Kim Xiao of TECRO, our representative office in the United States. Taiwan's first direct presidential election took place in 1996. It was a heady accomplishment in a steady journey of democratization throughout the decades. By 2014, Taiwan's democracy has matured to the point where the peaceful Occupy Parliament movement in 2014 paved the way for political change while unleashing a wave of youthful activism and civic participation in public affairs. Although Taiwan is a young democracy, it's standing firm on the front lines of the global struggle with authoritarianism. It also plays a leading role in advancing freedom, democracy, and human rights worldwide. During COVID-19, we've seen signs of democracy backsliding as authoritarian regimes justify human rights violations in the name of public health and the greater good. For Taiwan, we combat the pandemic with no lockdowns and the infodemic with no takedowns. Democracy in Taiwan isn't just for the people, but with the people. Effective counter-pandemic measures, including the mass distribution system and SMS-based contact tracing system, began as civic technologies from the social sector. They were amplified by governments and businesses working hand in hand. This people-public-private partnership is a motto we're proud to share. For example, our government supports the stationing of international journalists and NGOs in Taiwan. Over the last 2 years, Taiwan has accredited 50-plus foreign journalists, including correspondents of US-based media outlets who were forced to leave under pressure from Beijing. The government also welcomes NGOs to establish presence in Taiwan. Some of the recent high-profile arrivals are US-based National Democratic Institute and International Republican Institute. In answering the call made by the U.S., Taiwan has pledged financial support for Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, and we're willing and able to contribute to the International Fund for Public Interest Media. Both multilateral initiatives focus on combating corruption and mis- and disinformation, respectively, and are in line with the goals of this summit. A central plank in efforts to achieve these goals is the Global Cooperation and Training Framework. Via the GCTF, Taiwan works with the United States, Japan, Australia, and other like-minded countries in organizing workshops on critically important international issues like anti-corruption, media literacy, and women's empowerment. Stronger together, in this case, is more than a social media hashtag. It's the very essence of the free world's unshakable belief that democracy can deliver. To give no trust is to get no trust. As democracies, we must trust our citizens and invest in public infrastructures in the digital realm. This is the best and the only way to protect and advance our shared values. Today's summit is the perfect platform to bring democracies together and explore ways to collaborate. I look forward to discussions with you all. Thank you. Live long and prosper.
So y'all are mad funny in the chat, by the way. Y'all were going in on this representative from Taiwan. I'm not even going to read the comments because y'all went in. But what I found interesting is that they described Taiwan as a young democracy, even though in Taiwan there is more inequality and poverty than on mainland China. And one of the interesting things about Taiwan is that Taiwan's biggest trading partner is the People's Republic of China. The only reason there is some modicum of prosperity on Taiwan is because of the Belt and Road Initiative. China, even though China regards Taiwan as a breakaway province, China still trades with Taiwan. And that's one of the few reasons why Taiwan actually has some level of success. But even with that, there's a lot of sweatshops in Taiwan. If you look at your clothing and ornaments at home, I'm sure you'll find a lot of stuff that says made in Taiwan. So Taiwan is branded as this liberal utopian paradise compared to China, when there's so much economic inequality on the island that is not democratic. But even though its political system is different from socialism on China, it's branded differently. And obviously, I think one of the biggest things here as well is the fact that you have Audrey Tang, somebody who obviously is somebody from the LGBTQ community, and the attempt to weaponize and to subvert LGBTQ liberation for the purposes of imperialism, to try to create what I and many people have described as intersectional imperialism, and to try to portray these quote unquote democracies as being progressive and anti-imperialist and socialist governments as being reactionary and conservative. That seems to be the dominating strategy. Your analysis and reaction to that, Comrade Mercedes?
I didn't like her live long and prosper thing. I thought it was a joke. I thought it was a joke. It was just a lot again of like the same stuff again of like anti-China and oh, everything else is wonderful if you're allied with the US and otherwise, if everything from Beijing is bad. I'm not too familiar with like Taiwanese history or the bits and pieces from Hong Kong, like the Hong Kong like liberation protests or whatever from a few years ago, but it was just like the same nonsense drivel and just obnoxious bullshit. The whole summit was just obnoxious. The whole summit was just frustrating. Every clip out of it is frustrating and redundant.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think the anti-China bashing is, like we were mentioning earlier, projection and fear, because people are aware that the tide is turning in favor of socialism, of collaborating and trading with the People's Republic of China and the Belt and Road Initiative. Comrade Dakota, your reaction to Audrey Tang and Taiwan?
Not positive.
I loved it.
The first thing, like, as soon as they said non-binary folks, I was like, oh God, like, because they love to do that. Like, oh, like Taiwan and Israel are just like, they're so great to their gay people, like, and liberal, like Pink News and Pink Star News and all this bullcrap. Like, they love saying that kind of thing. Like, I remember one time I read a BuzzFeed article and it was making fun of Nicolas Maduro for eating an empanada. And at the very end of it, they were like, we at BuzzFeed are so against fat shaming, but we still hate Nicolas Maduro. And I was sitting there, I was like, well, how nice. How nice that you're against fat shaming, but you're totally fine with supporting genocidal sanctions and like just eat shit. Like, it's just so irritating to me. Like, because I've heard it so many times, like even in like gay people in Britain who I've talked to are like, well, we really appreciate what the conservative government did for us when it came to gay marriage. It's like who cares if you can get married if there's millions of gay people across the world who are having bombs dropped on them, or they're living on the streets, they can't get health care in the first world, et cetera, the so-called first world. Like, I don't know, the weaponization of identity politics and all that to serve imperialism, they've done it so many times. Even like Marianne Williamson, when she was running for president, like her big thing was like, we need to leave Iraq and Afghanistan, but maybe we should keep some people there to ensure women's rights, etc. Like, women's rights were much better before you got there in the first place, one. And two, shooting women does not do very good for their rights.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Especially, when you look at like austerity and sanctions, it targets women more, it targets vulnerable populations more. Whoever that may be. Like, you already, might not have access to this resource, and the fact that you're in, whatever group that is already disenfranchised, then you add economic burden and you add social burden and political burden and just all these obstacles that, unless you are of the privileged few, you're not going to get. So it just makes everything worse. And they're doing that, not only with having this person here who's non-binary, but they're using a Chinese person, which I get, it's Taiwan. There are Chinese people in Taiwan. But it's like, oh, you see, they're Chinese. So therefore, everything that they say about China must be true. And don't question it, because then it must be that you are racist and and you're a homophobe.
And they do this thing where they make it like with the whole live long and prosper, like Star Trek thing. Like, oh my God, that's so cute. Like, wow.
Oh, she's like us. Oh my gosh. Oh, sorry, not she, excuse me. They're like us.
I don't know. It just pisses. It's a way to make imperialism, capitalism, these, two very diabolical things, cute and new and shiny. And, I don't blame them for doing that, because they have to, because saying they want to bomb people into oblivion in pursuit of profit isn't a popular thing to do. So they have to do other things, but it's just so transparent.
Yeah, definitely. Shout out to Char Darling. As a queer trans woman, I do not want liberal NGOs defending my community. Non-standard proletarian, that's the mentality of intersectional imperialist. And that pink washing of imperialism is all over. And we've seen it used against Zimbabwe, against African nations, against Iran, against Latin American countries for contradictions. And that's not to say that there isn't room for improvement to be made. Of course, I think that is something that is important to continue pushing for. But to seek liberation through Amnesty International and through Democracy International and all these institutions is a ticket to hell, is a ticket to national destruction. And I think that so many people fall for this. And this is something as well that within the CIA was promoted. My friend Caleb talks about this all the time with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the use of postmodernism, the weaponization of identity reductionism, a term that, shout out to my comrade Erica Keynes, who uses the term and has coined the term identity reductionism. A beautiful way to put it, because at one hand, we're not trying to minimize the legitimate struggles and grievances of LGBTQ community, but on the other hand, we have to be careful of when those talking points are subverted, weaponized, and used for the purposes of imperialism. So I think y'all had a very great analysis and rundown of that. What I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is Dakota's favorite politician. This is Juan Guaido, who is declared the still declared the interim president of Venezuela, even though it's been like fucking 3 years already. And this joke was one of the talking heads at the Summit for Democracy. So I'm going to play this and get some analysis about the attacks against Venezuela's socialist democracy.
Es un honor en nombre de mi país poder ser parte del Summit for Democracy, un espacio fundamental para defender la democracia, un deber y a la vez una preocupación de todos los que estamos aquí reunidos. Agradezco al presidente Biden por la invitación y sobre todo por el reconocimiento de la lucha de mi país.
For recognizing the government of Venezuela, where we continue to resist the fight for freedom. Now that we're facing the greatest migration crisis, where over 6 million Venezuelans have been displaced. This happens because Venezuela saw a undermining of its democracy, and the defense of democracy is the only way to fight back against an authoritarian regime that is attempting against the lives of our citizens. 56% of our population is now living in extreme poverty, which is the end of rule of law, and where we see the first regime in Latin America that is being investigated by the International Human Rights Court. There's a huge influence of drug trafficking, totalitarian groups that have been benefiting from the support of an authoritarian regime in exchange for favors. And we are convinced, however, that we can save democracy, and with this we can save Venezuela. Some things that the bad guys are winning, but no, when we see everyone joined here today with efforts to strengthen democracy, the voices are being heard loud and clear. Democracy can happen, but we have to go beyond just talking. We have to bring the following proposals. First, to build a unified front with a multilateral focus that makes the regime accountable for their crimes, to create mechanisms to protect the democratic forces and activists of human rights that are fighting on the ground and are victims of persecution. 3, to increase accountability to build lasting peace, and especially in Venezuela, it's necessary to commit to political exclusive solutions and negotiated solutions that lead to the good of all sectors of society. And last, to support the states that receive refugees and migrants. This is necessary. For this, it's necessary to have a strategic vision and the backing of the resistant movements in countries with authoritarian regimes that defend democracy. We are in a battle. As the interim president of Venezuela, institutionality of my country is my priority. In my country, to insist on the fight against for democracy is not a war, but a battle, a sprint that will help democracy. We are stronger together, and we can save democracy.
Guaido talking about we have to save democracy and Venezuela. The crazy part is that he's saying we have to go beyond just talking. We all know what that means. More coup attempts, more attempts at destabilization. Comrade Mercedes, your reaction to that?
I can't help but think of that BuzzFeed article and how they were saying, "Oh, we're against fat shaming," and then there's like a twisted part of my mind. It's like, yeah, you could be really against fat shaming by like starving people and then bombing them to death.
Right.
You won't have to worry about it anymore.
For real.
He's just again. It's like the whole thing. Every last thing that they're saying is like, you were doing this, the U.S. is doing this, the West is doing it. Everything that you said, we're against this, we're everything, every last drop of it, and it's just incredible. I wish I had a degree in like psychology, because I want to look at this from like a narcissist or like an abusive, like psychopath point of view, and I'm like, this is a macroscopic version of it. It has to be.
Yeah. It's like gaslighting at its finest. It's saying the complete opposite and just subverting reality, making this fantasy land of U.S. democracy, making it seem like that's really what's going on. Your reaction, Comrade Dakota, especially, you've been to Venezuela several times. What's your take on what Guaido was saying?
I think he needs to be medicated. And it's funny because so the last time I was in Venezuela, I went to numerous voting sites and I asked people, like, what do you think of Juan Guaido? And the two words I heard most often were mamajuevo and payaso. So, to say the least, that he is unpopular, like, it's almost funny. It'd be funny if it wasn't so sad. He's nothing. He has no power. He has no supporters. Like, he's not even president of the National Assembly anymore, and that was his whole claim to fame. I like how he mentioned, he's like, some people say that the bad guys are winning, because he knows what he considers the bad guys. The legitimate government of Venezuela is just as firmly in place now because it's supported by the people, because they just won elections less than a month ago again. I don't know what his end game is. It's intriguing to me because he obviously, plays a role and has this purpose that he's fulfilling from the United States. Those people that he screwed over in Colombia, the people that he convinced to have a mutiny from the Venezuelan army, who the handful that did stupidly, he then abandoned and they're living homeless now in Colombia. This person is going to have a lot to answer for one day. And it also goes to show, if someone received foreign backing in the United States and tried to declare themselves president and got backing from the international community, money and coup attempts and all this stuff, in any other country, they would be, they'd be up against a wall. But in Venezuela, this person can, go around, can vote, can, go to his fancy restaurants and hotels. So I don't think, how is it possible that Venezuela is this terrible dictatorship of authoritarianism when they let this moron go around and make such an ass of himself? It might be better for himself if he were in prison, because then it'd be a little bit less of a laughingstock.
The funny thing is, or not the funny thing, excuse me, the encouraging thing, I think, is this happens so many times throughout history where you did have a guy like Guaido and he actually was successful, that it's really inspiring and encouraging to see, wow, it's not happening anymore. It's happening so much less, where you have people are no, we're not doing this. International, he's got all the support in the world and he still can't fucking win. It's great.
And they've said many times, the countries in Europe and some of the ones in Latin America, Guaido himself, Trump officials, they really thought that this was their key. They said we gave it 2 months after the recognition of Guaido for the government of Venezuela to fall. It's such arrogance, because they don't realize just how unpopular the opposition is and just how many diehard Chavistas there are on the streets every single day. But it's willful blindness, because they could very easily find that out, but they prefer to live in their fantasies.
It reminds me of Bolivia as well, after the 2019 coup against Evo Morales, and they installed Jeanine Áñez, who was essentially a fascist, evangelical, nutjob, crazy person who was carrying out genocide of indigenous peoples, of socialists. And look at her now. I mean, I think she's locked up. Nobody gives a fuck about her. And
she's locked up, and the U.S. tried to block voting in the U.S. They tried to block it in Japan. Governments tried to block it in Japan, in London, in New York, everywhere. Didn't happen, and she's still bye.
Yep,
I love it.
And I think the spell is wearing off, right? This whole idea, that Pinochet style method of taking out a left-leaning president, installing a right-wing US-backed puppet, and trying to carry on as if nothing happened. I think that whole spell is wearing off, and I'm glad to see that. And I think that right now, I'm excited to see that Venezuela has a lot of economic growth, a lot of relative stability, right, relative to 2017. What I want to do, just wrap up here, because we just have a few more minutes. It's been really dope speaking with you, comrades. I want to play a clip. This is from Comrade Dakota, our very own Comrade Dakota, on Fox News with Tucker Carlson, talking about Venezuela. And I think this conversation perfectly exemplifies the debate between bourgeois democracy and socialist democracy, and why people who defend capitalism do not understand why nations like Venezuela are democratic. I had to speed up the audio a little bit, so my apologies if it sounds a little funky. But yesterday, when I was doing a stream about Stalin, some asshole, I don't know who, did a copyright strike on me. So because I was playing some copyright content, so I had to switch it up a little bit just so that they don't try to fuck with us, because it's Fox News. So we're going to play this and get your reaction.
Well, the American left has celebrated Venezuela's socialist economic model for a long time and called for its imitation elsewhere. Unfortunately, as you just saw, the model appears to be encountering some fairly predictable difficulties recently, with violence, political unrest, and even starvation now sweeping the country, which, by the way, does not have toilet paper. Does the left still think that socialism works? Dakota Lilly is with the group Students and Youth for a New America. It's a pro-socialist youth organization, and joins us now. Dakota, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you.
So do you see a pattern here? I mean, it's not just Venezuela, but it's also, I don't know, 1970s Bulgaria, Romania and Albania and the Soviet Union and Cuba and North Korea, and every country that has tried this economic system winds up in poverty. So do you see a connection between all of these cases?
Well, Tucker, what I think is extremely important is we need to acknowledge that what Venezuela is currently facing right now is terrorism at the hands of the opposition. The opposition has bombed schools, they've bombed buses, they've taken wiring and strung it across roads to behead cops on motorcycles. These aren't choir boys, these are violent extremists hell-bent on taking away the progress Venezuela has made over the past few years.
So who's got the guns in Venezuela? Private gun ownership is obviously illegal in Venezuela, and so the overwhelming majority of firearms are in the hands of the government. So how can the opposition to the government be the ones perpetrating the violence?
Well, Tucker, if you look at the casualties that have happened in the past few months in these protests, the majority of those that have been killed have been trade unionist leaders, have been dedicated Chavistas, have been people on the left. So obviously the ones that are being targeted are those that support the government.
Dakota, I don't want to rock your world, but I think reliable statistics probably pretty hard to come by under the Maduro government, I would say, which controls, of course, all the statistics coming out of Venezuela. But the bottom line is the country has had a socialist government for over 10 years. It's become poorer every year, despite having the world's largest oil reserves. Does that give you any cause to stop for a second and say, you know, maybe this whole socialism thing doesn't work that well? It's never worked anywhere. It's not working again. Maybe there's a lesson for me as a young American, no?
Well, Tucker, everyone in Venezuela, including the president, Nicolas Maduro, acknowledges that reforms are needed in things like food distribution and elsewhere. But very few, if anyone, in Venezuela want to go back to the pre-Chavez years of unbridled capitalism. So much so that the leader of the opposition, Enrique Capriles, calls himself a socialist.
Presumably he means something different by that. Is your Spanish pretty good? I mean, do you have a pretty good handle on popular opinion in Venezuela? How would you know what the majority of people in Venezuela want?
Well, I mean, all you have to do is look at the astounding amount of elections that have been held over the past few years, ever since the early 2000s when Chavez came in. People have come out time and time again to vote for the United Socialist Party, to vote for constitutional referendums, and to vote for Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro in elections that have been certified by international observers like the Carter Center.
Comrade Dakota laying the law, speaking facts on Tucker Carlson, and this has got millions of views, by the way. Shout out to you, Comrade Dakota, for defending Venezuela. Not only just some liberal outlet, but like a right-wing outlet. So much there to debunk. Before we turn to you to obviously talk about that, maybe we can get some reaction from you, Comrade Mercedes.
Dakota, you're my new hero. First and foremost, it was beautiful. Do you know, I think it's funny, like, how this dude, he was like, oh, this is like a random thing, but he was like, oh, people don't even have toilet paper. And it's like the number of, I don't know how often, there's a lot of people around the world, whenever people go like, oh, there's no toilet paper, we're like, you don't use soap and water. Like it's better, it's cleaner, and it's better for the environment. Like it's, I don't know, like I know for a lot of like Caribbean, Latin American countries, it's like it's okay. It's like that is the epitome. Like there's no toilet paper, there's nothing. Oh, it's fine. We got soap and water. We can clean. It's okay. I don't know. Maybe I'm too Caribbean for that joke. But just this guy tried it. He tried. So is your Spanish any good? Maybe you just didn't understand. It was priceless. That was chef's kiss, honestly.
He's like, I hate to rock your world, but
I hate to rock your world.
He's like, all right, bro. Dakota, you're well, first of all, tell us about like how was it actually like being on there? What was the experience like during and the lead up to that, being after that? And what was the reaction afterward? Because I know a lot of the escualidos were hitting you up and trying to like slander you and shit.
Yeah, so I can't remember if I was 18 or 19 there, but that was when I was in college still, and it was very like the actual interview lasted, it was live and it lasted about like 10 minutes. But what like got to me was I hadn't even, when I was done and when I was going downstairs, I didn't even get to the lobby of the building where I did it when my phone just started like blowing up. Like people, like, you know, every 4-letter word, like everything, really bad, and like contacting my family, etc., all that stuff, like doxing, really bad, and a lot of like, and then actually to this day, like people still, if I go to New York or somewhere like a major metro area, like some people who are escualidos, like people who left Venezuela under the Chavez years or whatever, because their fortune was expropriated or threatened or whatever. One guy like found, like I was walking down the street and he confronted me and like saying how like he was starving and the people in Venezuela are starving, all this stuff. And I look at his Instagram because he then like found me on Instagram later as well. And like he's spending $500 on bottles of perfume and like Louis Vuitton, decked out in Gucci, all this stuff. Like they really like they don't get it. And he doesn't. And Tucker, like it's weird because he says he's against like interventionism and against wars and stuff like that, but then he's fine with parroting the same propaganda that leads and acts as justification for these interventions, etc. So it is what it is. He tries to kind of paint himself as like this populist who is questioning regime change wars and never-ending wars, which, those are good things, but I'm just not sure how genuine it is. But and also they were lies. There is toilet paper in Venezuela. There was toilet paper in Venezuela. There are some economic problems, as there are in every single country in the history of the world. And people in Venezuela still live better than, I'd say, most of the people in Latin America. Better than a lot of aspects, Colombia or Bolivia or Peru, Ecuador, etc. Like the social achievements, I'm sure I don't have to go off about them all, but 4 million homes built almost for free for people, the elimination of illiteracy, highest calorie intake in the history of Venezuela happened under Chavismo. The availability of food, the amount of Venezuelans that eat 3 times a day is 97%. Electricity is 100% reached throughout the country. Like it's just bullcrap. It's bullshit. They want to. Venezuela represents the threat of a good example for the people in the United States and the people across the world, and they don't want people to know about the amazing things that have happened there.
Most definitely. And just to wrap up here, because I know, Dakota, you have to dip out. Any final comments from you, Comrade Mercedes, about not only Venezuela, but the Democracy Summit and just the myth of capitalist democracy in general?
I think it shows like I think it shows the world's changing, you know, and they're trying real hard, you know, like the final boss, but I think it's done. I think everybody knows it's done, and they're trying real hard to just hold on to whatever scraps of capitalism and that they have left, but it's done. And seeing how scared that they are really is inspiring.
Yeah. That's when revolutions happen, when the old way of doing things is no longer able to continue, and the fear within the ruling class intensifies to such a degree that they can't maintain their capitalist system of exploitation. So I'm excited and looking forward to that, and always remain optimistic, as we should, as communists, as socialists, as revolutionaries. I want to give you guys a shout out, Comrade Mercedes Gómez and Dakota Lilly. Both of y'all are amazing commentators and guests, and I look forward to having both of you on in the future. We're going to go out to some revolutionary music from Los Guaraguao, one of my favorite revolutionary groups. I hope you guys have a great week. Take care, and long live socialist democracy and revolution. Peace out, everybody.
And prosper.
Perdóneme, tío Juan, pero se ve que no sabe nada. Las cosas que yo le digo se sienten en carne propia, que en tierras venezolanas el imperialismo yanqui hace lo que les da la gana. Y es que usted no se ha paseado por un campo petrolero, usted no ve que se llevan lo que es de nuestra tierra y solo nos van dejando miseria y sudor de obrero, y solo nos van dejando miseria y sudor de obrero. Los niñitos más silentos que habitan allá en los cerros, más que vivir agonizan entretejiendo su sueño, más que vivir agonizan entretejiendo su sueño. Contésteme, tío Juan, no se me quede callado. Conteste si no hay razón en que sigamos luchando por echar de nuestra patria al yanqui que nos la quita y al lacayo que